Hi everyone. Waving hand today. I want to show you a quick learning session about pivot tables. If you often work with reports or data analysis, pivot tables can be incredibly useful, especially when dealing with large datasets or data that changes frequently. With pivot tables, you don't need to use complicated formulas, you just drag and drop to get insights instantly. In this video, I'll quickly walk you through the main steps so you can become confident using pivot tables in no time. Alright, let's get started. Here's my sample data. Let's look at the table below. I have around 10 sales regions. Products supplied by 6 distributors and the revenue of each order. To create your first pivot table, start by selecting any cell within your data range. Then, click on the Insert tab and select Pivot Table from the menu here. A Create Pivot Table window will appear. The first and most important part here is the table/range, which specifies the data range you want to use for your pivot table. By default, Excel automatically selects the entire data range, for example, from cell A1 to E201. However, with this setup, if you later add new rows of data, the range won't update automatically, meaning the new rows won't be included in your pivot table. So here's a quick pro tip before creating your pivot table: convert your data range into a table. That way, when you add new data, it will be automatically included. You'll only need to refresh the pivot table to update it. So press Cancel. First, select any random cell within your data range. Then click on Insert tab and select Table. A new Create Table dialog is appear. That's right, the entire data range from A1 to E201 has been selected. Next, click OK, and your data will now be converted into a table. You can customize the table theme in the Design tab. And also rename the table here, for example, change it to Data by press Enter. Now, let's create a pivot table for the data. Click Insert tab, then click Pivot Table. You'll see that the table range has now been changed to Data. Normally, we choose to create the pivot table in a new worksheet, so I'll select this option and click OK. As you can see, Excel has created a new sheet to contain the pivot table area. You can rename this sheet, for example, to Report. OK, after you create the pivot table, you'll see the Pivot Table Fields panel on the right-hand side. These are our data fields, including date, region, distributor, product, and revenue. Here we see 4 areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. So what do they do? I'll explain each one in detail. For example, if I drag region into the filters area, drag product into the row, revenue into the value, and distributor to the column. The filter area contains the state data we just added. Here, you can select any region from the filter list to display the corresponding data. You can click to select the regions you want to show, and the data here will include only the regions you've selected. Next is the distributor column, which includes 6 distributors here. Next, on each row, you can see all the products. There are 6 in total. And finally, the most important part, the values area, which represents the revenue data. By default, for numerical data, Excel applies the sum function, meaning we're calculating the total revenue of each product for every distributor. If you want to change the calculation function, click on Value Field Settings. For example, you can choose count, average, max, min, or product. There are many mathematical functions available here. In this case, I select average. So now, we have the average revenue data displayed here. You can update it, for example, if you want to switch back to showing the total. Click OK. Let's say you want to format the numbers to display in thousands and separated by commas, right? Select any cell here, then right-click and choose Number Format. Choose Number here, check Use 1000 separator, comma, set decimal places to 0, and then click OK. Now you can see that our data is separated by commas for every 1000, it looks much clearer. Now, let's go back to the Pivot Table Fields area. Here, you can remove any data field, for example, state, by holding down the left mouse button and dragging it out to the empty area of the table. So, we've successfully removed the state field from the filter area. You can drag the state field back into the filter area again. Do the same steps to add or remove the revenue field in the values area. You can also duplicate the state field into the rows area. This way, you can view a detailed report for each state. Yes, you can design your pivot table by dragging and dropping fields based on your specific needs. You can also customize the display further as follows. Go to the Design tab. On the left side, you'll see options for subtotals and grand totals. By default, the subtotal represents the total revenue for each region. If you don't want to display this value, you can customize it by going to the Design tab, selecting Subtotals, and then clicking Do Not Show Subtotals. Now, the subtotal values have disappeared. In addition, the section below, Grand Total, shows the total of all revenues. If you don't want it to be displayed, you can go to Design Grand Totals and select Off for rows and columns. Report layout refers to how the data is presented in the pivot table. You can choose the layout here. Typically, I select the tabular form. It will look quite detailed, as it includes the region, the product, and the revenue. The state is currently grouped, for example under California. If you want to display all items individually, you can go to Report Layout, Repeat All Item Labels. If you want to turn off the repeated item labels, just go back to Report Layout and select Do Not Repeat Item Labels. The repeated values will disappear. In addition, each state has an Expand button. You can click it to either expand or collapse the data. If you don't want to show this Expand/Collapse button, you can go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and disable the Expand/Collapse option by clicking on that. Once you turn it off, the buttons will no longer appear. Now I'm going to remove the state column. As you can see here, we have 6 products and the revenue for each product. Now, if you want to sort the revenue values in ascending order, just right-click and select Sort, Smallest to Largest. You can also sort by product name by right-clicking and selecting Sort from A to Z. You can adjust the number format of the revenue according to your requirements as follows. Right-click on it and select Number Format. A window will appear. Choose the Number tab, check Use 1000 Separator, and set decimal places to 0, so that no decimal digits are displayed. For example, if I want to show the grand total, I can do it like this. Go to the Design tab and select Grand Totals on for rows and columns. Okay, now you can create a duplicate Sum of Revenue column by dragging the revenue field into the values area again. It's created with the same values as the first column. But if we want to display the revenue as a percentage instead of a total, we do the following. Right-click any cell in this column, select Show Values as % of grand total. You can also choose other display options depending on your needs. This will distribute the percentage across the products. For example, Product 1 might be 16.65%, Product 2 might be 19.12%, and the total will be 100%. Similarly, I will continue to create another column using the same method. Now, I don't want to display it as a sum anymore. Click on Sum of Revenue 3, and a value field settings pop-up will appear. Then change it to average and click OK. I will format the numbers in this column the same way we did for the first column. Here, I want to rename these columns to more meaningful names for easier understanding. Now I'm going to remove the average column by dragging it out. Once it's removed, as you can see, the width of the remaining columns changes dynamically. So, if you want to keep the column width fixed, do the following. Click anywhere inside the pivot table, go to Pivot Table Options, and uncheck Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. Now, if you want to create another pivot table, you can also go back to Sheet 1 and select Insert a Pivot Table, just like we did before. But I have a faster way. Just highlight the existing pivot table, copy it, and paste it to another empty location in Excel. Okay, a new pivot table has been created. Now, let's say I replace product with distributor. We'll have the data grouped by distributor. Now we have a list of distributors along with the corresponding revenue percentage and total revenue for each distributor. Now we drag the region field into the filter of Pivot Table 2. Okay, you can see it has been added and applies only to Pivot Table 2, it won't affect Pivot Table 1. Alright, now how can we make it so that when we change the region in Pivot Table 2, the data in Pivot Table 1 also updates accordingly? The optimal way is to create a slicer to filter multiple tables. First, I'll remove the region field from Table 2. Then, right-click on the region field, or any other field in the Pivot Table fields list, and select Slicer, or you can go to Analyze and choose Add Slicer. You can select multiple slicers here to filter data for multiple tables. Here, I'm choosing one slicer, which is State. If you want to change a slicer from one column to multiple columns, go to the Slicer tab and, in the Columns field, select the number of columns you want to display. Here, you can select one or multiple states to filter the data in the second pivot table, depending on your needs. So how do we make it so that when you change the selected state in the slicer, it also affects Pivot Table 1? First, right-click on the slicer and select Report Connections. A pop-up will appear showing that the slicer is currently connected only to Pivot Table 2. Simply check the box to also connect it to Pivot Table 1, then click OK. Now, when you select a state in the slicer, the data in both tables will update accordingly. Now, let's go back to the data range in Sheet 1. If the data gets updated, for example, if I add, delete, or modify some records, what will happen? Here, I'll add a few new rows of data. After adding the new data, let's go back to the report sheet. For each pivot table, simply right-click and select Refresh. It's very simple. The new data will automatically be recalculated and updated. Okay, I will delete these rows of data and refresh again. The data will be updated. That's why we should create a table to store the original data. It allows the data range to adjust automatically, making it easier for you to update new data. You can also visualize the pivot table as a chart to make it easier to analyze or report. To do that, simply select the pivot table, go to the Analyze tab, and choose Pivot Chart. You can choose the chart type based on your needs. For example, I'll select a pie chart and click OK. For the second table, I'll select a column chart to display the data. That way, we now have two charts showing the revenue percentage and total revenue by product and by distributor across the entire state. Now I can also change the charts by selecting a state on the slicer. When the data is updated, it will also affect the charts. You just need to refresh, and that's it. At this point, we've basically completed all the main operations with pivot tables. Thanks for watching. Make sure to practice it right away. Follow me to learn more detailed tips about pivot tables and other Excel tricks in upcoming videos. Leave a comment below if you have any questions or doubts.